Welcome everybody again to another exciting episode of Quick Hits with BDSA. Joined here today with Kelly Nielsen, Vice President of Insight and Analytics over at BDSA. Kelly, thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks George for having me.
So BDSA just came out with a huge market forecast report. Why don't we start there? Tell us about the release of this. When's the last time you released it? And then we can start getting into the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So super excited about our latest market forecast update. So for perspective, we update our market forecast every 6 months. And so the last update was in February or late January, early February, or actually late February. And we've just updated our forecast as of late last week. And so really excited to provide updated perspective on the global legal cannabis market based on what we've been observing in 2021 and beyond.
So the numbers are starting to get pretty damn big, if I don't say so myself. Let's take a look here at your worldwide cannabis forecast. You're showing that this is going to be a $62 billion globally, billion-dollar industry globally in 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I just want to call out that this is really exciting for us because this is actually an increase over the forecast that we saw or that we released last February. We've taken our numbers up. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next few minutes, but really driven by the US market. And so based on the momentum that we're seeing growth in the US market, we're expecting the total legal cannabis market to reach $62 billion globally by 2026. And so, yeah, what you see on this slide is the bars I would pay attention to are those black bars and purple bars in the middle, which are calling out the U.S. Adult use is the black line, and U.S. Purple is the medical market. And so you see those really continuing to expand. And I think the key here is that there's really two factors that are driving that. The first being that the adult use market continues to grow at an increasingly rapid rate. And we've had this emergence of really big medical markets. I think the thing about the medical market that, if you take a look at that chart, is that we expect the medical market in the US to continue to grow for the next couple of years, but then actually start to decline and give way to adult use as time goes on.
Sure. And what we've seen in the past is that, these markets will continue to kind of they launch as a medical market, usually with fairly restrictive, kind of conditions, end of life, glaucoma, some of the ones that we really know cannabis to be super effective in treating. And then at some point they usually flip and say, okay, we're going to allow pain to be one of those conditions, and everybody hurts, right?
Pain, anxiety, PTSD are really like the big ones that can mandate the size of the medical market as it comes into fruition.
Sure. So once we see that expansion, you guys can see the slide there, right?
Yep.
But once we kind of see that kind of expansion in the medical and then the move to adult use, have we seen kind of the medical markets kind of start diminishing over time, right? People say, well, I don't need a medical license, I'm just going to get it.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because I do think that Arizona has given us a little bit of a new view on, what we expect from some medical markets. So either way, absolutely true that, regardless of the size of the medical market, once adult use comes online, the medical market does begin to decline. However, if you look at some of the most established states right now, so your Colorado's, for example, the medical market is an extremely small portion of that overall total size of the market. It's, somewhere around 15-20%, if not smaller, in Colorado. But if we look at Arizona, for example, going into adult use legalization, Arizona was $1 billion medical market. And so as this year has progressed, we've continued to see the decline of the medical market, but the split in contribution to volume from adult use versus medical is a little bit different than what we see in other states. That Arizona right now, the contribution from the adult use market, by the end of the year, we expect it to be roughly around 40% or so, give or take a few percentage points, which, from a contribution to volume standpoint is different than what we see in other markets. Now, granted, we do expect that contribution to volume from adult use to continue to increase and medical to continue to decrease. But it does get us thinking, if you think about these other large medical only states right now, like Florida and Pennsylvania, We think adult use sales is still a couple of years out in both of those markets, but I think it does raise the question of when they do come online, what is that contribution to volume from adult use in those first couple of years?
Yeah, that's interesting too. And I think, from those early days of, medical then to rec, I mean, there was a fairly long lag time to, between those kind of focus points on the timeline. And I think we're starting to see it shorten. I think we're starting to see states like, South Dakota, I think they legalized medical and rec, combined, right? They didn't go through
First state to do that
process. Not that that's a huge population base and everything else, but it is exciting to see that we're this huge increase in this forecast, right? And we've talked a lot over the years, and everybody kind of forecasts out these numbers. Obviously, having that type of scientific analysis that BDSA puts behind it gives a tremendous amount of credibility to these numbers. Over companies that are just basically surveying companies and asking for poll data. I mean, this is hard data that's based in reality. And I've always kind of said, I mean, you look at the alcohol industry at being $250 billion in the U.S. alone. There is a point in time where cannabis has the potential to eclipse that, and I'm excited for that. But let's hone in on the U.S. market. I mean, this is where the cannabis renaissance is happening. Believe it or not, we have a nation of consumption and consumers that are an ideal target for brands and retailers to create opportunity. And let's look at specifically your U.S. cannabis forecast here.
Yep.
2021, you're projecting to finish up at around 25 billion, just a hair shy. Maybe we can all go out and buy a little extra cannabis and get that over 25 billion, and really doubling by 2026. That's a pretty intense CAGR, right?
Absolutely. And it's really being driven by a couple key things. So, when we were looking at our forecast in February, the story was all around, the continued growth in existing markets and the increase in consumption, and new markets coming online. And that continues to be an overarching theme here, right? But we've seen it continue. There's other things at play that, as we've watched 2021 come to progress throughout the year, that a couple additional things are layered into that. So you still have your mature markets are continuing to grow. And that, quite frankly, the rate at which some of the biggest markets or the most mature markets have been growing, quite frankly, continues to surprise us a little bit. And so we're excited to see that growth, and we want to make sure that we're giving credit where credit is due. And so the likes of California and Colorado, increasing double digits, 2021 over 2020, over 2020 when we look at the first half of the year.
Yep. And, here's the legal spending, medical versus adult use. Obviously a overall decline in the medical spend by 2026 over the previous few years, but obviously a spike in, 2023, 24 a little bit.
Yep.
And that's really based on some of these new states that are coming online, right? And really starting to activate markets. And I'd love to talk about the contributors to the growth that you have here on this slide.
Totally. Yeah. So, I mentioned that some of those existing markets continue to be part of the growth in the long term. So California being the biggest one here. But, there's a couple other things that are really interesting. So I want to call attention to some of the newly legal adult use markets that are kind of coming to the end of their second year. So namely Massachusetts, Illinois, and Michigan, that the growth that we have seen in those markets year over year is showing that today, when states are coming online with adult use, they're growing at a much more rapid pace than they had been in the past. And so we're seeing that growth and that maturation happen much earlier, but they're still continuing to grow. And so kind of seeing the patterns that we've seen emerge with Michigan, Illinois, and Massachusetts leads us to look a little bit differently when we think about markets like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, that are these high population states. Because we know that once sales is available, which, just for perspective, we expect sales to start in early 2022 for New Jersey and mid 2022 for New York. And once that happens, we expect product to be widely available fairly rapidly, which, is a little bit different than what we had seen in some of the prior markets as they were coming online. So that's
which will be a great time for people to come to MJ Unpack in New York, May 4th and 5th, right in Midtown Manhattan, and for the brand and retail executives, and listen to Kelly's latest forecast.
We will have more new numbers come May, which,
awesome.
It's constantly developing. So, I think that's the first pattern we saw is, what did we learn from Illinois, Michigan, and Massachusetts? And what does that mean for markets like New York, New Jersey, and, Connecticut and these other like high population states that are coming online. I think the other thing to consider is the greater growth potential that we've been observing from some of the largest medical markets. So I mentioned earlier that, we don't necessarily think that adult use is going to be immediately available in states like Pennsylvania or Florida, but those medical markets are so large and they continue to expand. Florida expecting to reach, a 1.6, if not slightly higher, billion-dollar industry this year, strictly from a medical market. Pennsylvania, pushing $1 billion medical market. And so I think there's two things that play with that. The first is those medical markets are increasingly, or just they're bigger than what we've seen in the past, with the exception of Arizona. And that's because of some of the things that we just talked about, right?
Sure.
And I'd be remiss not to put Oklahoma on that list as well. That these markets, because of the way that they're fairly open medical markets, they are bringing huge contributors to volume, and we expect them to continue to grow over the next couple of years. And then added layer is that when they do ultimately turn toward adult use, which again, not for a couple of years from our projections, but it's expected that when they do turn on adult use, that they likely will be able to move very quickly, similar to what we saw with Arizona, because they will have had the infrastructure, they will have had the supply chain already developed to make that switch fairly easily.
I mean, and I know that you guys kind of, take a considerable amount of information into your kind of system to be able to make these projections on when states are going to legalize. I mean, it happens very fast, right? Like it seems to move slow, and then it happens very fast. And we're seeing kind of this cascading effect where, obviously with New Jersey moving forward on legalization, that, New York says, I mean, we're going to lose massive amounts of revenue and tax revenue opportunities if we don't legalize. And obviously kind of probably was a little bit of a stimuli to get them moving forward on it. And, certainly as, we see Ohio and Pennsylvania and some of the, Virginia and some of these other states, really start legalizing. I mean, who knows, maybe Mitch McConnell might be able to roll up in Kentucky or wherever he's from and get a joint. But it's gonna, I think, happen fast. And I know this is a little bit of a loaded question. I mean, do you see in your forecast possibly federal legalization, or you still feel that that's beyond 2026?
No, so our point of view is that we expect some degree of federal legalization coming actually within the next year. But we do not expect that to really open the floodgates, because I want to be really clear that when we talk about federal legalization, what does that mean? And, it's funny.
Yeah,
because
it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's there's a lot of maybe layers and levels of federal legalization. From our perspective, at minimum, when we're talking about federal legalization, it's, really an overarching decriminalization and overarching banking reform. And so if we start
Safe Banking More Act, get rid of 280E, and theoretically we have a legal industry, right?
Exactly. And so that's kind of like level one. And so with those things, we expect some sort of reform, some sort of point of view on that in the next year or so. But the key is, no matter what happens in the next couple of years, like our point of view is that we still expect the regulated cannabis industry to be regulated at the state level.
Yep.
That we expect states to maintain their right to determine how cannabis is going to be shared, distributed, sold, grown within their own borders. And I think there's two dynamics to that. The first is that you have these huge states that are already legal, that have spent so much time and energy figuring out the economics of it that works for their state in order to maximize the profit potential from there. And they don't necessarily want to give that up, right? And,
sure.
And so it's not going to be these floodgates of, sudden cross-state commerce and those sorts of things. I do think the one thing that, we're keeping an eye on, and I don't think it's a huge risk today, but we're keeping an eye on, is, as some sort of federal legalization does occur, to what degree is there going to be mandated oversight from organizations like the TTB or the FDA? Because that could have some overarching implications. Our assumption right now is that that's not going to happen and be part of any, kind of like a starting point, or it's not going to dramatically change the way that states are able to sell product today.
Yeah. It's interesting, and there's precedents for interstate commerce, compacts and everything else, and it's going to be that balancing act, right? If they start opening up and the states really do have the ability to control and regulate their own state markets, obviously creates complications for, companies that are operating in multiple states, having to deal with multiple regulatory bodies, multiple regulations, advertising restrictions, et cetera. I think Oregon and Northern California of kind of just being such a wonderful places that, cannabis is grown, and the opportunity for them to potentially, export into Nevada, which is, relatively arid climate. Having lived there for 15 years, nothing really grows unless it's heavily irrigated. And there's problems with water from the Colorado River right now. So we don't know, what that looks like. I mean, and I think it could really, when the states look at this is if they do create these interstate commerce agreements, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose, right? There's going to be an opportunity to create these economies of scale for the producers and the manufacturers of edible products to, centralize an operation in a single state for multi-state distribution. So some states are going to win jobs and some states are going to lose jobs. Obviously, states that are bringing product in, there's going to be a state tax that goes to the importing state. As we start seeing this federal legalization unfold, and I know that there's been some proposals out there with kind of a progressive tax over time. I mean, there is this huge revenue opportunity for both the state and the federal governments, and both have been doling out a lot of money, for a lot of years, that they need that tax revenue. It's just, if this becomes overly burdensome to the legal regulated market and the prices become, so high, I mean, it's going to, again, foster the kind of unregulated side of the market that doesn't, provide that product safety, safe packaging to keep this out of the hands of minors. You have a better industry, I think, if we can keep this, fairly well regulated and marginally taxed, because the opportunity, if we get to that $250 billion and there's, 5% tax to the federal government instead of a 20% tax, and that's suppressing it down to $100 million, the federal government wins in that. It's a question of math, right? But Kelly, thank you so much. Really excited to have you come and kick off our programming at MJ Unpacked next month in Las Vegas. Do you want to share with our listeners any teasers for your presentation at our show?
Yeah, we're in the process of pulling everything together, but our overall presentation is going to be around how you win in store and what that really means for retail partners. How do you leverage data and basket analytics and pricing analytics to really make sure that you have the right customer in the door buying the right products at the right time at the right price, and really diving into that.
And upsell them.
Our brand partners. What's that?
And upsell them, right?
And upsell them, exactly. How do you get them to put one more thing in their basket every time they're in there? So I'm really excited to be speaking and can't wait to see everyone in Vegas.
That's going to be awesome data for the brands and the retail executives coming to our show. Kelly, thank you so much as always. We'll probably take a little bit of pause here and resume our quick hits in November after our event. But thank you so much for sharing the insights from BDSA Analytics, the leading market intelligence and consumer insights firm in the industry. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, George.